Python used to say, and now for something a little different. Monty Python. So anyway, this is something that I can't remember ever teaching about or ever hearing anybody teach about, actually. So today's going to be about Mother Mary. Now, those of you who grew up in a Catholic church, or perhaps still are involved in a Catholic church, you hear about her quite a bit, but probably not what I'm going to say today. Maybe, but so I want to start out by saying the title was A Jewish Woman Who Changed the Course of History, because she's the one that gave birth to Yeshua, whom we know as Jesus in English. And whatever you believe about him, the fact is that our entire calendar reckoning is divided between before he was born and after he was born. So that's a pretty big impact, not to mention the millions of Christians throughout thousands of years that have done things, good and bad, but have done things in the world that wouldn't have ever happened had he not been here. So a huge impact on the course of our history, all of which began with his birth, which began with Mary. So in this church, we say that Jesus is our wayshower, and we try to learn about what he taught and what he did and what he lived as a model for how we would like to think and live. So one of the questions that occurred to me was, so who is his wayshower? And the answer to that is more than likely his mother. So I want to tell you something as kind of like a preliminary thing to start with on this, and then tell you some things that you may not be aware of. Most of you know by now, between what Fillmore's taught and what others of us here have taught, the Jesus that you were exposed to in traditional mainstream Christian churches is presented, I'm not saying this is false, but he's presented as the one and only Son of God for all time, and as the one and only Savior of all mankind for all time. There's never been another, there never will be another, and if you don't hitch your ride on this guy, you're in trouble because that's the only way there is to get there. And that he was sinless and perfect and innocent and born as the Christ, the anointed one of God, and was the Messiah. And then later, actually, in the church teachings, including currently, was God. He is God. So that's the picture that we're presented of him. What we aren't presented of him is Jesus as a man who grew up in a Jewish community, was baptized and circumcised as a Jew, who lived a kosher life, who went to synagogue, celebrated all the Jewish festivals. In his own lifetime, had 100% Jewish apostles. There were no Gentiles in his movement when he was alive, so far as we know. That might not be true, but by all the records we have, that's true. And what he struggled with and what his life was like as a human being. We don't much hear about that. Except in Unity, we hear more about that because we have a kind of a different understanding of his work and his role. So if you hear about Mary at all, and likely you don't, I'll tell you why in a minute, but likely you don't hear much about her. If you hear anything about her, it's probably from the Catholic tradition, and what you hear about her is, they call this in Latin, or Greek rather, Theotokos, and it means mother of God, that she literally gave birth to God. As a child, when I first heard that, that was a really interesting concept to me. It's like, how does that happen? But anyway, and whether you believe that or not, I'm not trying to challenge any of that. But you hear that about her, the mother of God, that she was also sinless and pure and holy, and that she was a virgin when she gave birth to Yeshua. And in the Catholic Church, she was not only a virgin when she gave birth to Yeshua, she was a virgin forever. She never knew a man in her whole life. She was what's called perpetual virginity, was Mary. And there are reasons that was taught. So I'm going to tell you a different side of Mary today. And this is an historical side of Mary. Nothing I'm telling you is something I made up. Nothing is channeled by some New Age psychic. This is all in history, in the Bible, and outside the Bible. biblical historians and scholars now, especially in the last few decades, have found a tremendous amount of things through archaeology, through discovery of documents, through discovery of letters, through early church historians like Origen, St. Jerome, Josephus, Philo. There are a number of them. If you're interested in any of these sources, you can talk to me later or email me or something. I can tell you how to find them. But there's tons of historical sources that people don't pay any attention to unless you're a biblical researcher, or a scholar, or a historian. And that's where all this stuff comes from. So the first thing, I guess, that I should say is that Mary was just a Jewish woman who gave birth to somebody, and that somebody changed the whole course of the world. Now, as far as the church's theology, you may or may not like this, but this is also factually and historically true, which the Catholic Church has admitted during the era of John Paul. The Catholic Church, back under a number of popes, including Pope Innocent, came up with the story that the only way for a woman to be pure was to be a virgin, because sexuality was a bad thing. Priests had to be celibate. Women were only pure if they were celibate and virgin. And that there were two role models in the church. Mother Mary, who was the perpetual virgin and holy and dedicated to God, and you should be like her if you're a woman. And Mary Magdalene, who was a prostitute and whore, who had everybody in half the Roman Empire and was terrible. And you should not be like her. Now, the fact is, nowhere in any record, inside the Bible or outside of the Bible, does it ever even hint at that she was a prostitute. That was entirely made up by the Pope, which the church has now admitted. So that's absolutely untrue, and never was true. And they knew it wasn't true when they taught it. But they were trying to draw this contrast between this is a good woman and this is a bad woman. You want to be like this woman, you don't want to be like this woman, which was not teaching the truth of anything. It was an agenda the church had to try to manipulate how people lived. So that's an historical thing that the church has actually owned up to fairly recently. So those are the two examples. Now, the other thing is that if you look at the biblical record, one of the things you discover in the Gospels and in the book of Acts is that Mary is with Jesus everywhere, almost everywhere, his mother Mary. And there are lots of Marys, by the way, which is also confusing. There's Mother Mary, there's Mary Magdalene, there's his Aunt Mary, there's Mary of Jerusalem, who was married to Cleopas, who had the big house where they had the Last Supper. There's a gazillion Marys. There's a gazillion Jameses. You know, I mean, it's like, hi, I'm Bob. You know, there's lots of them back then. Yeah. This Mother Mary was with him. She was with him, of course, at birth. She was with him in his childhood. By all accounts, all biblical scholars agree on one thing. They don't agree on much, but they agree on one thing. Joseph was dead before they were teenagers, before Jesus was a teenager, because he appears in his early life record, and the last time you see Joseph is Jesus when he's age 12, and they take one of the pilgrimage to the temple. That's the last time he appears in any written document anywhere. We have no idea where he died, how he died, what happened to him. He just disappears from history. But most, if not all, scholars that I know of believe that's because he died. So he is now gone before Jesus is a teenager. And so Mary raises him. I'm going to tell you more about that in a moment too. But Mary raises him. And the fact that they mention she's with him at the wedding in Cana, she's with him in the travels, she's with him in Nazareth, she's with him in Capernaum, she's with him in the synagogues, she's with him when he travels with his apostles, she's with him at his crucifixion when the men have all deserted him, she's with him after the crucifixion. She's with him all the time. And she almost is never named. It names him and all his male apostles and then says, and his mother and some women. Because they were not keen on naming women in that era. And if you read the Bible, you're going to see lots of men named, and right next to them, and women. You know, like Okay, so make of that what you will. But her name's not there. One name that is there all the time, whenever she is with them, is Mary Magdalene. She's always actually said by name. So she was important in that time to be named, because most of them aren't. There are a few other women in the New Testament that are named that we know of, like Salome and Joanna, and some others that were intimately involved in his ministry. Frankly, this is an aside, but I think we ought to do a study on the women in the New Testament sometime. Okay. So anyway, so this is part one of that, I guess. But interestingly enough, Mary's kind of wiped out there. Now, the other thing is sort of interesting, and I think that was on purpose, because I don't think by the time the Gospels were written, which was not in Jesus' lifetime, it was decades after his lifetime, I don't think that the people writing at that time wanted Jesus' Jewishness or his family to be important to their theology at all. I think they wanted to divorce their theology from Judaism and from his family. Because I bet you don't know this, but do you know who took over the Jesus movement after Jesus died? Who did? No, well, yes, that's true. Just a little further down the road. Yes, that's true. But immediately after he died, there was a successor who took over his movement and led it and was the undisputed leader of the Jesus movement after Jesus died. It was not Peter. And it was not Paul. It was his brother James. Brother James. Not cousin James, not Apostle James, brother James, blood brother. That, if you don't believe it, is in the book of Acts. Read the book of Acts. It's really clear that James was the head of the movement, and he centered that movement in Jerusalem, probably in the house where they had the Last Supper. That probably became their headquarters. Most historians now believe that. When James was killed, which he was also, guess who took over the movement after James? Somebody you've never heard of. Simon. You know who Simon was? Another brother. This movement was a family affair, and we don't get that picture in the Gospels at all. Do we? No. Nope. And if you go to the Vatican, you see statues of Peter and Paul. Do you see any of James? No. So the family was downplayed in the Gospels because they had a different vision of Jesus they wanted to present. Again, not saying that necessarily what they teach is false, but they were emphasizing a different aspect of Jesus. Now, Mother Mary hardly appears by name in the New Testament, but do you know where she does appear by name? In the Quran. And do you know that she's the only woman in the entire Quran mentioned by name? Don't you think that's interesting? So, let me tell you about Mary. This is what biblical historians are pretty sure about for now. They have documents of these things. Mary was born probably about 19 BC in Sepphoris, which was the largest city in Galilee at the time. Huge metropolitan city. 3.5 miles from that city was a tiny little farming village called Nazareth. Ever heard of that? Yeah. That's where Joseph was from. Mary was born in Sepphoris. She was born to Joachim and Anna. There are two ancient texts that talk about Joachim and Anna, and I'm going to give you just a short phrase quote. Joachim was one extremely rich man. Is that the image you have of her? No. That's the historical reality, though, according to the documents we have. Her family was very wealthy. Joseph was not. Joseph was called a tekton. A tekton we translate as carpenter, but it really didn't mean that. It meant builder. So it could have been somebody doing carpentry. It could have been a stonemason because they worked a lot with stone back then. It could have been like a contractor, like you would hire, like these people that we hired to redo the church. There was a master contractor who hired other people he didn't necessarily do all the construction himself, but he coordinated all of that and designed all of that. That would have been a position Joseph had, and probably Yeshua too. And that was in those days what, they didn't call it this, but in those days that would be like middle class for us. They weren't wealthy, but they certainly weren't poverty stricken. They had a good livelihood. So it was probably maybe like what we might consider a middle class family. We're always taught that the disciples and all Jesus' family was extremely poor. Aren't we usually taught that? Probably not likely. We know that two of his apostles, James and John, worked for Zebedee, who owned his own fishing fleet on the Sea of, not a boat, a fishing fleet on the Sea of Galilee. He was a commercial fisherman. They weren't poor. And one little telling thing is there's a place where Jesus is talking about money, and we quote this sometimes, and it says, it's harder for the camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into the kingdom of heaven. We quote that, don't we? And we try to argue about what is a camel through the eye of a needle. And we have all these things we talk about. What we don't talk about is what says right after that. And his apostles then said to him, then how are any of us to be saved? Why would they say that if they were poor? Nobody ever talks about that. Okay, that's an aside, but kind of an interesting one, don't you think? All right, so moving on. So this is another thing that you probably don't know. There are two Herods in the Bible also. There's Herod the first, and then there's his son, Herod Antipas. Herod had three sons. They all ruled different parts of Galilee at different times. Herod Antipas was the one that was ruling Galilee when Jesus was teaching. But Herod the first, Herod the Great, was the one that was alive when Mary was born. And he was king of Galilee, which is where Sepphoris is. It's the largest city. So now Mary's born in Galilee, in Sepphoris, the largest city, and it's just 3.5 miles from Nazareth, which is where Joseph was. There was an uprising. Herod was not a full Jew. He was half Jew. And so a lot of Jewish people objected to him taking the throne of David and being king because he wasn't fully Jewish. And Herod knew that. So Herod was on the lookout for any rightful heirs to the throne of Israel. And if he found any male heirs of the Davidic lineage, he had them, guess what? Killed. He even killed all his own sons eventually, or most of them, and several wives. It was not a safe thing to be part of Herod's family. He's kind of like Henry VIII, if you remember that story from England. He's like, oh, I'm going to marry you, and I'm going to kill you, and then I'm going to marry her. So there was an uprising against Herod. And the Romans, who were still occupying Israel at that time, helped Herod because he was an ally of Rome. Herod had helped in the battle between Julius Caesar and Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Herod was instrumental in lending his support. And so when Octavian, who became called Augustus Caesar, won, he gave Galilee to Herod. That's how Herod got appointed king. So he was a Roman friend. So the Romans helped him, and they squashed the rebellion against Herod in Galilee. And in Sepphoris, which is where Mary lived, and where Jesus was probably, likely, maybe, born, maybe not, maybe Nazareth, but definitely Mary lived there as a young child. When she was a young child, this uprising took place, and they crucified over 2,000 people in Sepphoris, in public, and left them all on the crosses for weeks. And Mary, as a child, would have seen that. That's not something we were told or think about very much. Now here's another interesting connection. St. Jerome, the guy who put together the Latin Vulgate version of the Bible, St. Jerome says that Paul, who was originally Saul, St. Paul, the apostle, he's not really an apostle, but Paul in the New Testament was born in, guess where? Sepphoris. So his family grew up there. And after this revolt, his parents were so afraid that they moved to Tarsus, which was not in Galilee, and they became Roman citizens for protection. That's why Paul was a Roman citizen in the New Testament. All right, so eventually, Joseph and Mary get married, and there's a lot of stories about that, about was he an older guy, were they a young couple in love, how did that all work? And the fact is, we just don't know. There's so many different stories about that. Take your pick. But eventually they got married. Joseph and Mary got married. And she gave birth to the person we call Jesus, whose name was Yeshua in his own language. And she was probably 15 or less when she gave birth to him. So a very young teenage girl. That was not unusual, by the way, in that era, for 15 and 16-year-old people to be married and have children. That was not uncommon. But she was probably about that age. And, now mind you, she is living in one of the most dangerous and volatile areas of all of Israel right now, with her newborn son. And before that son is 13 years old, her husband dies or is killed. So she's raising Yeshua by herself in one of the most violent times in Israel's history, in one of the most violent areas. How would you like to be doing that if you're a woman? But she wasn't just raising Yeshua. The Bible says he had brothers and sisters. And they named them, except for the sisters. Back to the familiar theme again. But the sisters are mentioned in non-biblical historical documents and by some historians from the time. So I'm going to tell you his family. His firstborn was Yeshua. Was she a virgin when she conceived him or not? That's a matter of faith. None of the early records say that. The virgin story is later. The earliest Gospel of Mark we have says, and Jesus was born to Joseph and Mary. There's no hint of virginity there or anything miraculous. That's a little bit later story historically. But, whatever you believe is fine. And again, we don't know. So we weren't there. Nobody inspected her and said, yep, she definitely is. So we don't know. But maybe she was a virgin. But she gives birth to Yeshua. But as far as being a perpetual virgin, the Bible itself says in multiple places in the Gospels, these are the brothers of Jesus. James, whose Hebrew name would have been Yaakov. Joseph, whose name would have been Yosef, after his dad, presumably. Jude, whose Hebrew name was Judas. That's not Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed him. That's the brother Jude. His letter is in the New Testament. It's called the letter from Jude. That's in the New Testament. That was Jesus' brother. He had a brother named Simon, who's the one I told you a minute ago, took over the movement after James was killed. And then he had sisters. So he has 4 brothers. So that means 5 sons. And then outside the New Testament says sisters, but outside that, the documents say he had 3 sisters. They were named Salome. She appears all the time with Jesus in the New Testament. She's with the women that travel with him. She's with Mother Mary. She's with him at the tomb. She's with him afterwards. She travels with him. That was his sister by other historical documents. And another one named Mary, after his mother, whose name was Miriam. And another one named Anna, after his grandmother. So those were his sisters. That's 8 children that a single woman is raising by herself in one of the most violent areas of all Israel in its history. Do you think that was an easy thing to do? No. Do you hear about that struggle? And how brave she was and resilient she was and strong she was to keep this family together and safe during that whole time? And who is Herod persecuting? And then later after him, his son Herod Antipas, who are they trying to get rid of? Any legitimate males who have a claim to the throne of David. All of her sons had that legitimate claim. All of them. She has a family that has, with Yeshua, has 5 men who have rightful title to the claim of the throne. Do you think Herod would like to have them around? No. They were at high risk. And Mary knows what happens to people that oppose Herod and the Romans. She's seen them hanging on crosses since she was a young girl. And she ended up seeing her son hanging on one too. That's not an easy life. Actually, she had 3 sons that were murdered, all because of who they were. Yeshua was the first, then James was killed. James was thrown down from the tower of the temple, which would have mostly killed him by that fall. And then after that, he was stoned and beaten to death by clubs. So he was killed. And then after Simon took over, after James's death, Simon was also crucified. 3 sons out of 5 she lost being murdered by either the state or the Romans. So that's some background of the real Mary, the woman Mary that we don't know. Tell you a little bit more about it. The first miracle that Jesus ever did. Anybody know where that was? The wedding at Cana. Right. Who convinced him to do it? His mother. There we go again. Hard to say no to a Jewish mother. Right. Do you know what the difference between a Jewish mother and a pit bull is? Eventually, the pit bull lets go. So Mary was also godmother to John the Baptist, because it was her cousin Elizabeth who bore him, and she made her godmother to John the Baptist. And John the Baptist and Jesus were close their whole life until John was killed. In fact, most historians believe, partly because of Josephus, but a few others too, that Jesus was actually a student of John the Baptist and studied with him and worked with him. And then when John was killed, Jesus stepped into that role and took over that ministry. And if you read their message, particularly the first chapter of the Gospel of Mark, what they say is John the Baptist's ministry, which is to preach repentance for the forgiveness of sins. That's also what Jesus says his message is, to enter into the kingdom by repentance and forgiveness. So they were very, very close. Who do you suppose, with Joseph being gone, any of you raised teenagers? Any of you raised 8 of them? Yeah. Who do you think it was that instilled the values of faith and persistence and resilience and compassion and carrying on when you faced danger, of not yielding when you were at risk, but standing up for what was true? Who do you think instilled those values in him? Probably his mother. Yeah. And instilled them in his whole family. This whole ministry was very largely a family affair. Again, if you read the Gospels carefully and the book of Acts carefully, let alone the things outside the Bible, his family, much of his family traveled with him through his ministry and through his teachings. Guess what else the women in the ministry, not just Mary, but the other women in the ministry, Mary, his sister Salome, Mary Magdalene. By the way, to come back to Mary Magdalene a second, I'm sure you've all heard the theories about Jesus and Mary Magdalene being wed and being married. There is no written documentation of this, but there are early legends that people write about in the late 1st century, mid-2nd century, that the wedding at Cana, when Jesus said, why should I do this? And Mary said, this is your job, this is your responsibility, and you should do this, was the wedding of Yeshua and Mary Magdalene. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but that's a very, very early legend, which would also explain why Mary thought it was her business to get the wine taken care of, because she would have been the mother of the groom. So, yeah, who knows? That's just another who knows situation. One more thing about Mary that we probably don't hear about is that if you follow her bloodline, which is in the Gospel of Luke, not the one in Matthew that everybody looks at, which is Joseph's bloodline. And that's another interesting thing, don't you think? So Joseph has no part in the fatherhood of Jesus, but the bloodline through which he's descended and proves he's a rightful heir of David is through Joseph. Okay. Mary's bloodline is in the Gospel of Luke, and she does have Davidic line also, but guess what else she has? She's descended from Aaron. So she has both the priestly and the royal bloodline, both of them, and all 5 of her sons do. They have rightful title not only to the throne of Israel, but to the high priest position of Israel. All of them. Have you heard that before? Have you thought about that before? Me neither. So there are also documents that talk about James, the brother James, putting on the vestments of the high priest and going into the Holy of Holies, which he would be entitled to do because of his bloodline through Mary. So the other thing I want to mention is that they now, just recently, just in this past year, they've excavated, there's a place in Jerusalem that they believe was the home the Last Supper took place in. It's a very large, wealthy house in a wealthy section, near where they would have gone out the gate to go to the Garden of Gethsemane and all of that. But they've excavated under it and found the original house underneath that. And a lot of biblical historians actually are convinced who knows again, that was the house where the Last Supper was held, and that's the house that Mother Mary and James and Salome and then the apostles used as a community center because it was so large and well known throughout the many years after that for the Jesus ministry. So that site may be something that we actually know now. I want to tell you one other thing about Mary, that just how stories start. I'll go back to the women because I missed that part. So what the women did in the ministries of Jesus, besides supporting them, was they provided all the logistics. They provided the meals, they provided housing, they provided medical care because there weren't doctors back then. Women were midwives, women were the healers. And there were some very wealthy women. Joanna was one of his followers. She was the wife of Herod's personal steward. They were very wealthy and lived in the palace. She was a follower of Jesus. She provided a lot of the funding. Many of the women provided the funding. If the women had not done the logistics and the travel care and the arrangements and the money, you probably would have never heard of Jesus. How often do you hear about the women's role in his active ministry? Hardly ever, right? I mean, hardly ever. It was a huge, important thing. And the other thing was that besides being devoted to God, Mary was devoted to family. And I think in our era, in people a generation younger than my children, I am witnessing family orientation starting again. People wanting to have children, people wanting to raise families. There was a time in our culture where that was not a popular thing. That seems to be turning again. Mary was very much a pro-family person. So I think that there's a lot of ways her courage and her integrity and her compassion and her faith in God, her resilience among incredible obstacles, are all things that we can learn from today. And like Yeshua, there were a lot of stories about her. One story was that the brothers of Yeshua and sisters were actually Joseph's children from a previous marriage, and that they were not hers at all. So she was still a virgin, and that they were stepchildren. There's no indication of that in the Bible whatsoever being true. The Eastern Orthodox churches pretty much think that they were his cousins, but none of the language in Greek or Hebrew indicates that they were cousins. There are words for cousins. They don't use those words. They use brothers and sisters and family. So I don't think that's true. So when Mary finally dies, there's a story. It's a Coptic story. It's an early Coptic story. And the story is that when she finally dies, there's only a few of the apostles left because most of them have been killed by now. But she dies before they're all gone. And when she dies, she gathers together the few remaining disciples that there are. And she says she wants to be buried in this particular dress with this particular belt around it. So they dress her in that. She says some final words to the few remaining apostles and family members, and she dies, and they bury her in this tomb. And as you may know, Yeshua had sent out apostles to all over the world. They were working in many places, Egypt and India and Persia. And Thomas had been sent to India. So you hear a lot about Thomas if you read Indian literature. Well, the apostles who were left, Thomas was one of them, wanted to get word to Thomas that Mary had died, but they weren't sure exactly where he was. So they weren't sure how to do that. So about a month later, Thomas ends up coming back to the Jerusalem area and meets with the remaining apostles and families. And they say, well, we have some really sad news for you. You know, a mother has passed. And he said, no, I know. And they're like, what do you mean you know? And he said, well, Mary came to me when I was in India and told me that she was passing and where her tomb was to be and that I should come back. And that's why I'm here. And they, given all the things they've seen, they didn't believe him. But you see that a lot in the Gospels with the apostles. And even though they witnessed the miracle of the 5,000, they didn't notice it. You know, that's kind of what the Gospels say. And so Thomas said, no, she really did. And she told me you wouldn't believe this story, so she gave me proof. And he opens up his satchel and pulls out a belt. And it's the belt they buried her in. So then they go to the tomb, and she's still in the dress, but the belt is gone. So that's the Coptic version of many versions of Mary's death. We have no historical record of it, so we don't really know what happened. But we like to tell tales about important people and to make them even more important and to make their memories last. So one of the things that's different about first century than now is when you read first century stuff, they are not concerned with facts. It's irrelevant to them. I'm serious. They're concerned with spiritual messages. You know, so the Good Samaritan story, the talents story, the faithful stewards stories, all of the stories you hear were those real? Did Jesus tell them because there really was a guy beaten up and a Samaritan saved him? Was that the point? That he was a news broadcaster and trying to tell you what actually happened on the road? No. He's trying to get a point across. Most of the stuff we read, we think, oh, they're claiming this is factually so. No, they weren't. They were trying to get a message across to you. For example, the whole idea of the resurrection, did the resurrection really physically happen? Well, maybe. But even if it didn't, the point is, the spirit of who this guy was lives on. The Romans didn't kill it, and it's still available to you right now. That's true, whatever the physical part of that happened to be. And they weren't concerned about that. They were concerned about getting the message across. So anyway, that's a few things about Mary that maybe you didn't know. So I'd like you to think just briefly for a moment, then we'll do our little meditation. So have you ever had any challenges in leading your spiritual life? Have you ever had people that you didn't feel safe to say what you really thought around? Maybe not physically safe, but at least socially safe, where you wouldn't be outcast or chastised or argued against. So if you can think for a moment about things that you've struggled with in your life, whether it's finances, whether it's health, whether it's your spiritual calling, have you ever felt like you had a spiritual calling, that there was something you were supposed to do? I don't mean save the world, but I mean just something you were supposed to do. You were supposed to help out this church. You were supposed to help go weed the garden. You felt called to teach a class. You felt called to do something. And you weren't sure if you could do it. Or you didn't feel worthy to do it. Or you weren't sure it would be well received if you did do it. Kind of like my talk this morning. We all struggle with things. And I think one of the things that we sometimes miss when we read about Jesus or the apostles or Mary Magdalene or the women or whoever is that these seem like storybook characters because we know the whole story. You know, when he's being crucified, we know the story of, well, then there are Easter's, 2.5 more days. Easter comes. It's good. Don't worry, it's good. There was no Easter coming for them on Friday afternoon. They watched a man they loved be mutilated and killed that they thought was going to be their king and savior, and everything was done. It was all lost. We miss the human part of these stories. These were real people like the ones sitting right next to you. People like this. Not special divine people that came down from heaven and landed and went, now I bestow upon all of you. It wasn't like that. Ruth could have done that much better than me, but but anyway, you get the point. These are real people. And for me, when I think of these are real people struggling with 8 teenage children as a single mother in a hugely violent area, and not just raising them to look out for yourself, look out for yourself, look out for yourself. It's a dangerous world. Don't trust anybody. It's horrible out there. Look out for yourself, which is what a lot of people do now. That wasn't the value she instilled in them at all. It was a tough time. They had a hard way to go to become the people that we now think of them as. and to become the people that changed the course of history and certainly have changed our lives. If you hadn't heard of Jesus, you probably wouldn't be sitting here. If you hadn't heard of this church, you wouldn't be sitting here, and this church wouldn't be here if Jesus hadn't been here. Because the Fillmores would have had no New Testament to look at. It's a huge impact. And the impact they had was by being, here's the deal, this huge impact they had on history, the huge impact they have on us now, whatever we believe about them, that huge impact was possible because day by day they got up and did what their faith called them to do. That's all. That's all. They didn't have it all planned out. They had no assurance from God, here, if you do this, this is what will happen. They had none of that. They had another day of potential violence, of danger, of opportunity, and of, will you today act on your faith? Or will you not? That's all. That's the same thing you have. Same thing I have. And amazing things came out of that. Amazing things still come out of it when you and I get up tomorrow morning and say, I'm going to live my faith today. So let's just take a moment of quiet. And first, I'd just like to silently join me in our appreciation for the unsung heroes of the Bible. Men and women, but especially today, Mother Mary and Mary Magdalene and his sister Salome and Joanna and the unnamed women that we don't know, who are crucial parts of that ministry coming to fruition and enduring. People who dedicated their lives and helped to bring forward teachings that have changed ours. And today, and every day after today, what you do will not only affect the people immediately around you, it will affect the teachings and examples that are available to generations that come after you, believe it or not. So may we, in a quiet for a moment, get in touch with that same spirit that Mary found her strength in, that Yeshua found his strength in, and that all those that we revere found their inspiration, their clarity, and their courage in that spirit that they've discovered within themselves. May we touch that spirit in us right now and open our lives to it. And we have not only been left the example of Yeshua and turning to his example in spirit when we are troubled or looking for guidance, we have been left a feminine model as well. Camille talked about the feminine aspect this morning for a moment. We have been left an incredible model for that as well, that we can turn to anytime, whether we are male or female in this body, and find the feminine strength of the receptivity and the holding within the womb until something is ready to come forth. For the gift of Mary and her son and all that came forth from them, we give you our thanks. Amen. Thank you all.